everybody. It's wonderful to see such a large crowd. It's a great honor. Ramadan Kareem for those of you who are observing and celebrating. So I am very thankful for all of you here. I also wanted to say I'm Gil Hochberg, chair of the Department of Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies. And I wanted to also extend our gratitude to the Columbia Libraries, and especially to our Islamic Studies librarian, Peter. I knew the Polish one is going to get me. Magriek? No. Magreski. I should really be able to pronounce Polish Jewish names, given that that is my origin, but that is significantly harder for me than other names. But really our greatest gratitude today is to our donor, Dr. Marilyn Jensik Madina, who is sitting here in front. She is the curator emerita of Islamic art at the Met. We are very grateful for your presence here today. And we're grateful for you providing us with the funding for the Medina Visiting Scholar and the annual lecture, which you give to us to Misas as a gift to the memory of your late husband, Maan Madina, who was a professor emeritus of Arabic in our department. So please join me all in gratitude. And we have today what promises to be a wonderful talk by Nadia Cheikh. And I am going to introduce our associate professor, Gevrek M. Avedisian, associate professor of Armenian Studies and Civilization in our department, Alison Vakap, who will introduce Nadia. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. I feel very honored to introduce Nadia Cheikh, whose work has been very inspiring to a number of scholars in the field. I am also kind of surprised that I have an introduction here that is relatively short, but still at the same time packs a good deal of pretty impressive work into a small amount. So Nadia Cheikh is a scholar of the Abbasid Caliphate in Byzantium. She earned her BA in History and Archaeology with distinction from the American University of Beirut in 1985, and her PhD from Harvard University in 1992. That same year, she joined AUB faculty and was promoted in 2006 to the rank of professor. In 2007, she was the Shawaf Visiting Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. Her publications include Byzantium Viewed by the Arabs from 2004, which reviews sources in Arabic about Byzantium over a number of genres, and was translated into Turkish and into Greek. In 2013, she co-authored a book entitled Crisis and Continuity at the Abbasid Court, Formal and Informal Politics of the Caliphate of Muqtadar. And her book, Women, Islam, and Abbasid Identity, was published in 2015 by Harvard University Press and was recently translated into Arabic, which I am happy and honored to have an actual copy to show. At the American University of Beirut, she served as director of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, was the chair of the Department of History and Archaeology, interim associate provost, and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences from 2016 to 2021. And in 2019, she received an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant for an oral history project called the Arab Oral History Archive, Gender, Alternative Histories, and the Production of Knowledge. Professor Cheikh has co-edited 4 volumes and contributed to a number of anthologies and journals. She's a member of the journal editorial boards, notably the Journal for Abbasid Studies. In 2022, she joined New York University Abu Dhabi as the Vice Provost for Cultural and Research Engagement and Professor of History. I hope you all join me in welcoming Professor Cheikh tonight.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Is this working? I'm happy and honored to be here, and I'm grateful for your presence at this talk entitled Peregrinations of a Historian on the Mediterranean Shores. I was invited to be the Maan Madina visiting scholar in 2020. COVID restrictions prevented that from happening, so I'm truly happy that it has finally worked out. So thank you for the persistence. In this lecture, I wish to take you on a peregrination, my academic story, my research journey. It starts, this is the Maan Madina visiting scholar, and this is a photo of Professor Madina and Mrs. Madina. So it starts here, on the beautiful shores of the Mediterranean, in Beirut, Lebanon. This is Ramlet al-Bayda for those who know Beirut. More specifically, here at the American University of Beirut, this is where I chose to major in history. And I joined the UB in 1981 as a student in times of adversity. It was a civil war. And UB, by the way, is the alma mater of Dr. Maan Madina. He took his BA from UB. I decided to major in history, and I found out that being a woman gave me the freedom to major in the humanities. No such freedom for my brother, who was required to enroll in professional schools, and he was miserable forever after. The freedom that I was granted stemmed from disempowerment, from a social subtext that career was secondary to my life, since the main reason for my existence is that of giving birth, getting married, having children. The freedom to choose my major stemmed, in other words, from a gender bias. It was freedom nonetheless. In history at the UB, I focused on the late Ottoman and modern Middle East. I delved unhindered into the primary sources and was encouraged to question secondary sources unfailingly. I took courses on the history of Arabia with the late Dr. Kamal Salibi, as he had just published The Bible Came from Arabia. While this book was contentious from the outset, to say the least, it exposed me to the importance, even necessity, of revisionism. I graduated in 1985, 10 years into the Civil War. I could not wait to leave. I could no longer bear seeing and experiencing the destruction of my city. People had been leaving by the hordes, and I was impatient to join them. UB's excellent education, even during the darkest years of the war, opened the gates wide open, and in 1985, I went to Harvard University for a PhD in history. I had imagined that I would focus on modern Middle Eastern history as I had focused on this period during my undergraduate years. However, I stumbled into an incredible professor of Byzantine history, the prominent Byzantine historian, the late Angeliki Layou. Inspired as I was, I shifted my historical interest to an earlier period. And living as I was, and as we still are, in the non-ending turmoil of the modern Middle East, I shifted my interests to earlier, better times, to the Golden Age, to the Abbasid period. The arrival of Professor Roy Mottahide to Harvard at the end of my first year provided that possibility. Studying that period provided an escape and a wider scope for the imagination. I decided to link my interests in Byzantine history with the early Islamic period. And so in 1992, I defended my PhD thesis entitled Byzantium Viewed by the Arabs. I was teaching at Amherst College for a year when the chair of AUB's Department of History invited me to return to AUB. I returned. he did warn me, though only after I had accepted the job offer. He said, "You are the first woman in the history of the history department." And UB is an old university, so this was maybe 130 years, So when I returned to Lebanon in 1992, not many others were daring to take that leap. Although the civil war was officially over with the signing of the Ta'if Accords, Lebanon was still suffering from the consequences of the long, atrocious years of war and was struggling with a deep financial crisis, similar, frankly, to the one that it is going through right now. UB itself had suffered on all levels, and most recently, in 1991, when its main administrative building was blown up. The Department of History was located in College Hall, the main administrative building, and we had to relocate for almost 10 years until reconstruction was completed. My academic career in Lebanon allowed me to become increasingly conscious of the extent to which the medieval Islamic inheres in the Muslim modernity. What happens when a past rises up in the present? How can the modern enterprise of historiography operate in conditions where historical events of more than 1,000 years are experienced on a daily basis, psychologically, cyclically, liturgically, repetitively, and hence atemporally? The great Moroccan intellectual Abdallah al-Arawi has underlined the exaggerated medievalization obtained through quasi-magical identification with the great period of classical Arabian culture, the language of al-Jahid, the scholasticism of al-Ash'ari, the mysticism of al-Ghazali. Muhammad al-Kun has similarly asserted that all of the contemporary discourse emerging in Islamic contexts invariably, inevitably refers to the emerging period of Islam and the golden age of its civilization, used as mythological references to reactivate values and ethical and legal paradigms. Well, the golden age was the period of my research. I have had to navigate these complexities while at the same time bear in mind that the field of Middle East history continues to be, to a large extent, constructed and defined by theoretical and conceptual formulations that arise at the institutional sites of US and European universities. I built my research career in Lebanon and was privileged or challenged, I'm not sure I know, to undertake my research from the vantage point provided by my location. And so some of the questions that I carry with me are, does location impact fund research questions? Does my location give me more authority or less? How is the research of the locals received? Would my body of published work look quite different had I been at university located in the USA, for example? For the rest of the talk, I will share with you my research trajectory beginning with my first book, Byzantium viewed by the Arabs, and then I will go to the two main other areas of my research, court and gender. Like the majority of my peers, my first book was an extension of my PhD thesis entitled Byzantium viewed by the Arabs. I examined the Arabic Islamic view of Byzantium as it evolved through centuries of warfare, contact, and cultural exchanges. I wrote the thesis in Cambridge, but worked on the book version in Beirut amidst a tense international climate which has only gotten worse since, one that provoked writers and scholars to produce works on current and past East-West perceptions. And you know some of these. But only few scholars handled it from the specific perspective of Arab-Byzantine relations. Instead, most such works focused on the relations between the Muslim East and the Latin West. These studies were rooted in an ideological project that seeks to understand the antecedents of the current problematic relationship between Islam and the West. And there are many more since then. I mean, these are the works, that I was, that were important back in 1990. Very few of the stream of books address themselves, as I said, specifically to the relationship between Islam and Byzantium, hence the importance of Byzantium viewed by the Arabs. To be sure, this is not the first book on the subject. The first effort was undertaken by Abbasid in his Byzantium and the Arabs, originally published in Russian in 1902 and later appearing in 1935 in a revised French translation by Grégoire and Canard. In the 1980s, Irfan Shahid from Georgetown started writing his multi-volume Byzantium and the Arabs, which spans the 4th to the 7th centuries. In addition to the sources utilized by Vasilyev, which were mainly narrative history and geography, in my book, I used other genres of medieval Arabic writing, such as Quranic exegesis, biographical dictionaries, and prose works of balad or adab. The goal was not only to collect new information, but to produce an overview of primary sources that is conceptually novel. So what did this book offer? This was perhaps the first comprehensive and detailed treatment in monograph form of the way in which Arab authors viewed Byzantium from the 7th century and until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. In other words, this monograph analyzes material on Byzantium and the Byzantines in Arab Muslim sources over a long period. It traces the Byzantine images it evolved through centuries of warfare, contact, and exchanges in the context of regional historical developments. And I tried to show that the attitudes towards Byzantium changed over time. The premise of the book is that the image of Byzantium was conditioned by the fluctuations of Muslim-Byzantine relations, by the circumstances of the international conjecture, and by the internal conditions of the Islamic world. The image of Byzantium was also shaped within the texts as the authors carried on a tradition inherited from previous ages. Authors, compilers, reproduced earlier conceptions of Byzantium's image, but reformulated their sense of the Byzantine Empire under novel and changed circumstances. At the same time, I tried to show how the image of Byzantium in the Arabic Islamic sources was used as a ploy to enhance the image of its Muslim counterparts. Thus, while the Byzantine Empire was a real entity with which the Islamic polity had to deal with, Byzantium was also an imaginary category of difference against which the Muslims defined themselves. I will share with you one example. During the 9th and 10th centuries, talking common era dates, the Abbasid Empire exhibited a cultural dynamism as it sought to appropriate the legacy of the ancient world. The Abbasid leadership sponsored the systemic translation of ancient Greek texts, principally obtained from Byzantium. By contrast, the Byzantines had in the meantime developed an aversion to Greek pagan learning, and Byzantine scholars paint a relatively bleak picture of the status of Greek secular manuscripts in the empire during the time of their translation into Arabic. One consequence of the movement was the importance given to delineating the differences between Byzantine civilization and the learning of the ancient Greeks. It was the literati of the late 8th and the 9th centuries, men like Ibn al-Muqaffa and al-Jahid, who first brought into sharp focus the question of what exactly had the ancient nations contributed to the corpus of contemporary knowledge. Once the subject was broached, a heated discussion arose over the actual contribution of the Byzantines to the scientific knowledge of the Muslims, to the scientific knowledge that the Muslims were intent on acquiring from them. The famous humanist al-Jahid insisted in a famous epistle he wrote, Kitab al-Rad al-Nasara. He insisted that science and wisdom belonged to the ancient Greeks, a nation that had disappeared, leaving only the vestiges of their reason, athar uqulihim. These ancient Greeks, Al-Jahid observes, had a different religion and a different literature than the Byzantines, who, and I'm reading from the board, ended by claiming that the Yunan, the ancient Greeks, are actually a tribe of the Rum. Kitab al-Mantiq and Kitab al-Kawn wal-Fasad were written by Aristotle, who was neither Byzantine nor Christian. The Almagest was written by Ptolemy, and he was neither Byzantine nor Christian. The Elements was written by Euclid, and he was neither Byzantine nor Christian. Medical books were written by Galen, who also was neither Byzantine nor Christian. And similarly, the books by Democritus, Hippocrates, Plato, and many others who were neither Byzantine nor Christian. In reality, Al-Jahid says, the Christians and the Wu have neither science nor expository literature nor vision, and the names should be erased from the registers of the philosophers and the sages. This Philhellenic and anti-Byzantine attitude has been recently explained as stemming from contemporaneous events. The state of total warfare that Caliph al-Ma'mun had initiated against the Byzantines. The Byzantines were portrayed as deserving Muslim attack, not only because they were infidels, but also because they were culturally benighted as inferior, both to Muslims and to their own ancestors, the Greeks. The anti-Byzantine rhetoric among Muslim intellectuals continued in the following century, and its expression in the work of al-Mas'udi is highly representative. Al-Mas'udi, the great cultural historian of the 10th century, says that the Rum were neighbors of the ancient Greeks, and at a certain point in time, defeated and conquered them, annexing their territory and assimilating their people. In his eyes, the Rum, that is the Byzantines, who replaced the Greeks, were but pale imitators. At-Tawhidi similarly distinguishes between the ancient Greeks and the Byzantines. He mentions during one discussion that the Yunan, the ancient Greeks, possessed the qualities of deduction, research, and discovery. The Rum are skilled only in architecture and geometry. Al-Mas'udi adheres to the view that scientific and philosophical decline were a direct consequence of the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Al-Mas'udi believed that when Christianity had triumphed in the Roman Empire, it had all but obliterated Greek wisdom, hikmah, noting the rational sciences remained strong and well-rooted until the time of Christianity, when Christianity spread among the Byzantines. So Christianity struck a fatal blow to the scientific edifice. The vestiges of the sciences disappeared, the methods were erased, and all what the ancient Greeks had demonstrated, proved, and discovered was gone. A similar statement is found in the Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim. In his chapter on the philosophers, Ibn al-Nadim says that philosophy was prevalent among the Greeks and the Rum until the appearance of Christianity. When the Rum became Christians, philosophy became a forbidden subject. Some works of philosophy were burnt, while others were hidden away. People were prevented from discussing any philosophical subject if it went against prophetic teaching. The famous Muslim philosopher Al-Farabi also notes that the ancient Greek philosophers were so celebrated that the Roman Emperor Augustus ordered that copies of their works be disseminated for educational purposes. This state of affairs continued until the coming of Christianity, when after a meeting of the bishops in Alexandria, it was decided to exclude a large number of these texts from the curricula, leaving only whatever would help confirm Christians in their faith. Yet, while many Arab Muslim authors tried to depreciate Byzantine ability in the scientific and philosophical domains by crediting the ancient Greeks with being the source of all such knowledge, their assessment of Byzantine scientific knowledge nonetheless reveals a great deal of ambivalence. Taken as a body, statements in a variety of sources stretching over more than 2 centuries are conflicting and contradictory. For instance, Al-Jahid says that the Rum are a nation of theologians, physicians, astronomers, wise men, and arithmeticians, and they possess the rules of music. That's contradicting himself from the earlier text. The geographer Ibn al-Faqih states that in addition to being craftsmen, the Byzantines are also philosophers and physicians. Moreover, the Arabs could not deny that Byzantium was the repository of ancient Greek knowledge. The primary merit of Byzantium in the eyes of the Muslims was its role in the transmission of ancient texts, sort of having preserved these texts. And they were clearly impressed by the material that had been preserved by the Byzantines. This is indicated on a number of occasions. One such incident concerned a manuscript of the Greek text of Dioscorides, the Materia Medica, which was sent to Cordoba as a gift from the Byzantine emperor in 948. The Caliph asked the Emperor Constantine VII to send someone to help in its translation into Arabic. This translation was the starting point for a whole series of works which subsequently led Islamic Spain to become the center of pharmaceutical studies. Alongside the record which they provide of Byzantium's tangible role in the transmission of knowledge, the Arab Muslim sources display a certain ambivalence concerning the knowledge and wisdom of the room, an ambivalence complicated by confusion over the terminology used in the Arabic Islamic texts to refer to the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and the Byzantines. But the discussion is in any case self-referential. The rhetoric that we find is intertwined with aspects of Muslim-Byzantine relations, and more important perhaps, with internal intellectual and theological discussions and debates. It is thus difficult to reconcile various contradictory statements, and ultimately we are left to conclude in a specific case that this predominant ambivalence concerning Byzantine knowledge is in itself one of the main themes of the Byzantine image. Byzantium, viewed by the Arabs, had an impact on the field of Arab-Byzantine studies. As I said, it was the first comprehensive and detailed treatment in monograph form of the way in which Arab authors view Byzantium. And the impact of the book in the academic circles is also evident in the fact that Byzantium, viewed by the Arabs, was translated into Turkish and Greek, and it is currently being translated into Arabic. The second main area of research is focuses on the Abbasid court. My first article ever to be accepted in an international refereed journal was entitled, describing the other together the self, Byzantine Women in Arabic Sources. I remember when it was accepted, it was one of the happiest times. Evidently, it had evolved from my dissertation and signaled my early keen interest in gender history. So my work on gender in the Abbasid period provoked me to review historical evidence of importance in understanding the role of the mother of a particular caliph. The caliph is al-Muqtada. Her name is Shagab. This caliph is an early 10th century caliph. And so I was interested in investigating the role that his mother had played in state affairs. And so I wrote an article that was published in this volume, Gender and Politics, the Harem of al-Muqtada, published in 2004. The main discussion deals with the specific influence of the mother of the caliph, as well as with the broad topic of women's participation in the public sphere. I will say more about my research on gender later. From this initial article, though, I developed an extensive research program exploring the workings of the Abbasid court. And here I wish to point that comparative work with Byzantine studies helped me a great deal in conceptualizing my research program on the Abbasid court. I found that the kinds of questions that are pertinent in connection to the Byzantine court were also valuable for thinking about the Abbasid court. What is the terminology used in the Arabic sources to define the court and the courtier? Who was the courtier? Was it anyone who could attend the court, and under what conditions? How was the environment or space around the ruler organized? Who filled it? How did it represent itself, and with what degree of ceremonial or spectacle? What were the rights and duties, obligations, and privileges of the officers within the court and the household. As I embarked on studying Abbasid texts from the 9th and 10th centuries, I quickly realized the complexity of defining the court as an Abbasid phenomenon. And the very term court is rendered as balat by modern scholars without any assessment of what the term means and what underlies the particular terminology, specifically as it pertains to the Abbasid 10th century. My readings led me to conclude that balat is not the correct word for the 10th century, that the term dar comes closer to the concept of the court. This is the term used by contemporary sources to refer to the palace complex of the Abbasid caliphs, both physically and metaphorically, and for the people, populating it. What about the courtier? My analysis revealed that in 10th century Baghdad, the ruling class was constitutionally vague and not without features of a meritocracy. This unstable elite consisted of high-ranking military commanders, state bureaucrats, and courtiers, among whom the distinctions were blurred. In texts that belong to the Arabic mirror of princes genre, the following seemingly synonymous terms refer to the courtier: حاشية, خاصة, بطانة, أعوان, أتباع, خاصة الخاصة. The authors of these texts do not display great interest in apprehending these terms conceptually, as they fail to elucidate the nature of the tasks for each position or function. So it seems like they use them interchangeably. In trying to understand the terminology used to describing the Abbasid courtier, the work of Miskawayh is fundamental for this period, Tajarib al-Umam. It was composed in the atmosphere of the Buyid court, and being a secretary of a number of viziers, Miskawayh's activity as a historian was closely bound to his role as a courtier. So with this close study, I concluded that the term that most closely comes to describing the courtier is al-Hashiyah, plural al-Hawashi. In Tajarib al-Umam, Miskawayh mentions that the Vizier Ali ibn Isa abolished increases which had been extended to all ranks of the army, to the eunuchs, al-Khadam, to al-Hashiyah, and to all clerks, al-Kuttab, and employees, mutasarrifin. In one passage, Miskawayh states that when he became vizier, Ibn al-Furad proceeded to examine Ali ibn Isa with reference to the allowances of the Hashiyah. He said, in the 5 years of your administration, reduce the allowances of the harem, the princes, al-Hasham, and the horsemen. In his defense, Ali ibn Isa answered, your plan for meeting expenditure was to transfer sums from the private to the public treasury, thereby pleasing the Hashiyah. From this passage, it would seem that the term al-Hashiyah is inclusive of the harem, the princes, the Hasham, and the horsemen. So this exploration of various aspects of court and court culture were published in a series of articles, the first of which was the court of al-Muqtadir, its space and its occupants, where I problematized the definition and terminology of the Abbasid court that they have just summarized. The second important set of questions, though, that concerns the court of al-Muqtadir involves the particular functions, roles, and influence of individuals at the court, both administrative officials and members of the harem. And so I published a series of articles on the roles and functions of eunuchs, qahramanas, and the court of the prince. Studying the roles, the position, and the power attained by these individuals contributed to our knowledge of the functioning of a particular court institution in the early 10th century. This research program culminated in a co-authored volume entitled Crisis and Continuity at the Abbasid Court, Formal and Informal Politics in the Caliphate of al-Muqtadir. This was published in 2013. And basically each one of the contributors what happened? What has happened?
Just give me a second, sorry.
Okay, sorry. So each one of us contributed 2 chapters. These are my 2 chapters. One on the Chamberlains and one on the harem. And they address the interplay between public and private spheres of al-Muqtada's reign and highlight institutional developments while also focusing on the impact key individuals had on the socio-political arena. And so my work on the harem in 10th century Abbasid texts allowed me to challenge also the existing scholarly literature on the harem. I tried to show that thinking of the harem as a monolithic singular type does not reflect the wide variety of living arrangements for women in Islamic households in the early 10th century. So as is clear, gender has been a main interest, a threat in all my historical investigations. A central challenge in researching the early Islamic period is the lack of archival evidence. We don't have archives. This drives scholars to produce historical analysis based on literary works, chronicles, biographical dictionaries, and juridical writings. Since access to the medieval Islamic past is both dependent upon its texts and history is conditioned by them, it is necessary to shift attention towards an analytical approach that studies the texts while considering the ideologies beyond the texts, the possible patron supporting their execution, the potential audience to whom they are addressed, their relationship to other sources, and inquiries into their genre. And I have had to do that in all the research that I had to in all my research. With this in mind, and in my focusing on gender, I proceeded to author a number of articles with the purpose of understanding the ideological function of Abbasid Adab compilations, and more specifically how gender is organized and represented in these texts. This is, these are large anthologies of bellat, if we can call them this way, and a very important genre of texts that exist throughout. That's certainly an important genre in the Abbasid period. And so I approached Adab texts asking the following questions. What sort of thinking does the text want to produce in order to establish or maintain certain authorities and structures? What possibilities of thinking are excluded from the texts? This research program culminated in these articles, or some of these reflect on my investigation on other compilations. I try to look at these texts to try to find some kind of historical information in these very rich compilations. And so I published these articles over the years. And my work on 10th century Adab anthologies confirmed that these exemplary texts not only reflected the dominant ideology, but also contributed towards the dominant discourse by shaping, selecting, and confirming cultural constructs governing intellectual and social life. I wish to also add, and I have 2 articles in which I used a beautiful compilation called Al-Ahd al-Farid, a 10th century text which was produced in Al-Andalus, but also contains a lot of sort of Eastern material. And I want to say that in analyzing, the Al-Ahd al-Farid, for example, I was not only interested in the ideological formulations it represents for the 10th century Islamic context alone. For this text, like other texts in the Islamic tradition, persists in its contemporary relevance. It continues to be published and sold to the mainstream reading public. Therefore, it is legitimate to ask how far Al-Ahd al-Farid is still partaking in forming and promoting a particular ideology of gender. My work on women and gender culminated in a book entitled Women, Islam and Abbasid Identity, which was published in 2015. Tried to write this book to demonstrate how concepts of womanhood and gender became a major organizing principle for articulating Muslim identity. How can one write history through the insertion of women's stories? In other words, I mean to say, when a primary source on a text from the 10th century inserts a story about women, what is it doing exactly? What's happening there? So in Women in this book, Women, Islam and Abbasid Identity, I investigate the ways in which the discourses on women, gender relations and sexuality and those of identities intersect and are informed and constructed by each other in the Abbasid text. I wrote this book really with the hope of driving the field in a new direction, bringing in a methodology and an awareness to bear upon the early traditional Islamic texts. I singled out several categories of identities: the Jahilis, those of anterior times, those beyond geographical boundaries, so I revisited the Byzantines again, and hybrids of sorts, such as the women lamenters who attempted to defy some of the restrictions imposed on them under the new Islamic order, and the heretical Qaramita. So what I will do for the rest of the time that I have is to share with you the way I approached one of these categories of identities, namely Jahiliyyah. The Encyclopedia of Islam defines it as a term used in almost all its occurrences as the opposite of the word Islam, and which refers to the state of affairs in Arabia before the mission of the Prophet, paganism, the pre-Islamic period, and the man of that time. Is Jahiliyyah the antithesis of knowledge, ilm? Is it the antithesis of gentleness, hilm? In the feelings of the Quran commentators, Jahil is opposed to alim in the sense of one who knows God. Jahiliyyah is thus applicable to the period during which the Arabs did not yet know Islam and the divine law, as well as to the beliefs current of that time. And this is, from Lisan al-Arab, a very important medieval dictionary. Now, Ignaz Goldziher provided a more nuanced interpretation, suggesting that the primary meaning of the root jahala is not ignorance, but barbarism, especially the tendency to go to extremes of behavior. The jahil is wild, violent, impetuous, one who follows the inspiration of unbridled passion and is cruel by following his animal instincts. And when Muslims say that Islam ended the customs and habits of Jahiliyyah, they are thinking of these barbaric customs and wild mentality which distinguishes Arab paganism from Islam. Notably the arrogance of Jahiliyyah, the tribal pride, the eternal feuds, the cult of the revenger. In this conception, Jahiliyyah was not a period of time, now past, but rather something dynamic, a certain psychological state apparently driven away by the new force of Islam, but surviving secretly, even in the mind of the believers, ready to break in at any moment upon the consciousness. Hind bint Utbah is the main focus of this chapter in my book on Jahiliyyah. Her actions, her personality, her actions as portrayed in the text constitute a prototype of Jahiliyyah behavior. So what are the main themes in the presentation of Hind? Hind bint Utbah was married to Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan, and her family and her husband's family opposed the Prophet Muhammad, who was forced, along with his supporters, to leave Mecca to the safety of Medina. Hind's rage against the Muslims increased following the Battle of Badr. There she lost her father, Utbah, her uncle, her brother. Hind declared herself to be the greatest of the Arabs in terms of catastrophes suffered, more than Al-Khansa, she said. In retaliation for the defeat at Badr, the Quraysh set out on the next battle, that of Uhud, taking the women folk with them. The women, led by Hind, encouraged the men, singing, dancing, and beating their tambourines. Hind seems to have been especially keen on avenging her father, Utbah, who had been killed at Badr by the Prophet's uncle Hamza. These are, of course, known stories for Muslims. When the Abyssinian slave Wahshi heard his javelin killing Hamza, she seized the opportunity for retaliation. In a transport of vengeance, Hind and the women with her mutilated the corpses of the fallen Muslims. They strung their cut off ears and noses into anklets and necklaces. Hind finally ripped out Hamza's liver, biting on it. Hind, however, was unable to swallow the liver, that is, and spat it out. And I want to show you here, this is a scene from a very famous movie called Al-Risala, The Messenger. And this is the scene where Hamza is killed. And now we see Hind coming over with Wahshi, who had thrown his javelin.
Hamza. Hamza. هل تسمعني؟
Can you hear me?
أنا هند.
I'm Hind.
بنت عتبة.
بنت عتبة.
هل تذكر قتلك يا حمزة؟ أخ. عمي.
Do you remember you killing my father, my brother, my
هل يكفي موتك؟
Is your death good enough for me?
الموت قليل عليك.
No, death is not enough.
وحشي. مزق. مزق. أريدك بك.
I want his death. We don't see. In the next scene in the texts, Hind is seen standing on a high rock, screaming verses at the top of her voice. The Prophet's companion and later Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, recalled this moment to the poet Hassan ibn Thabit. He told him, "You should have heard what Hind was saying and seen her insolence as she stood on a rock reciting poetry against us and recounting how she had treated Hamza." Not only did Hind verbally acknowledge her crime, she had the nerve to proclaim it. Hind recited verses in which she expressed her deep sorrow, the deep sorrow she had been feeling, as well as the act of revenge that appeased her anger. Hind's behavior was constructed in a way that would reflect the prototype of Jahiliyyah, the age of barbarism characterized by wild acts yet untamed by the revelation of Islam. Hind's excessive arrogance and tribal pride, her inability or unwillingness to curb her passions and master her anger, and especially her thirst for revenge, epitomized the chaos of pre-Islamic times. Hind's arrogance and her excesses, as manifested in the Battle of Uhud, are nothing if not manifestations of jahl. The excessive behavior is evident in her acts of cruelty, verging on cannibalism. While mutilation of enemy corpses does not seem to have been uncommon, what was uncommon was the extreme intemperance, the overload in behavior, the chewing of Hamza's liver. Hind's actions at Uhud, with the desecration of the corpses, followed by the bursting in triumphant poetry with the malicious joy she conveyed, expresses the depravity of Jahiliyyah, and Hind's excess represents the jahl of Jahiliyyah. The accusations of cannibalism was part of a project to make Hind, and by extension such behavior, utterly outside the bounds of culture and civilizations. Hind, the violent and near-cannibalistic Jahili woman, becomes a prototype of anachronistic humans, irrational, regressive, existing in a permanently anterior time within the modernity that Islam had come to represent. The manipulation of the motif of cannibalism played an important role in the Muslim construction of the category Jahiliyyah, defining the cultural distance between the Muslims who would never engage in cannibalistic practices and the Jahilis who did, or near-cannibalistic practices. Hence, near-cannibalism functioned as an efficient marker in the discourse between civilization and barbarism, and also as a marker of cultural distance between the people who told the stories and those about whom stories were told. The key categories were now Muslim, representing the cultural norms of humanity, and Jahili, representing deviations from those norms. Hence, the act of cannibalism functioned as a temporal marker, and thus her savagery expresses temporal distancing. It is a marker of the past, their time, not ours. Hence, the act was monstrous, and with it, it is the whole of Jahiliyyah that was defined as a temporal monstrosity. The conflation of the female and the monstrous needs to be emphasized, and that's sort of, the main point of this chapter. The conflation of the female and the monstrous, as I said, needs to be emphasized. It is the female who was ultimately the principal locus for the cultural monstrosity that defined Jahiliyyah. I return to my personal journey. In 2016, I was appointed Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the UB. I was the first woman Dean in the long history of that faculty. The burden was huge. It was exhausting, frankly. I served a term. I was renewed for a second term, and then a catastrophe hit us. On August 4, 2022, a horrific explosion ripped the heart of Beirut. It could be felt in Cyprus. More than 200 children, women, and men lost their lives. 6,000 people were injured, and 300,000 people were left homeless. It was a turning point for many, including myself. My years in Lebanon had been thrilling, if ever difficult, plagued by wars, assassination, financial collapse. The port explosion was the last straw. I departed from the Mediterranean shores towards new shores. I joined NYU Abu Dhabi as Professor of History and Vice Provost, and the new journey begins. This is my first trip to the US since COVID. So once again, I'm most grateful for Columbia University, for the Madina Scholarship, for the invitation. And so I look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, so much. And would you like me to take questions? Would you like
I
to?
could. The lady and then Dr. Masan.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have 3 questions. Okay, so I'll start with the first one. Is pretty simple. So I haven't read your book, so I'm sure I would learn so much more from reading it, and maybe I will continue to ask this question. But so my first question is, what about the theologians? What about the Mutakallimun? Did they have the same view of Byzantium? Did they share the same view as the philosophers? So you gave us the example of Farabi, and you gave us so Masoudi's account of the philosophers. So of course, like the Muslim philosophers are pro-Greek. What about the Greek, those who were more skeptical towards the Greek sciences? Did they view Byzantium in the same that was the first question. The second, and in the background, I'm thinking of the role anyway, but I'll keep it short. So the second question is about conversion. Was so okay, they're culturally inferior, but is there hope to change them? And so now I'm thinking of Bakilani was sent as an envoy to Constantinople, and the idea was that yes, that he can argue with the Christian theologians and convince them and somehow succeed in cultural elevation. And then the third question is about the gender, is about gender and, let's say, values. I was reading recently the Quranic scholar Izutsu on the Jahiliya concept of generosity, and I didn't know about this, really recent. And he says that I don't remember what he quotes, but in Jahili poetry, you had a distinction between sort of this kind of excessive, irrational generosity, so as a masculine value, so like men are like spending too much and doing irrational, and a female value is how like the female is that which restrains like this excessive passionate. And then he said that for the Arabs, generosity was a passion. It wasn't a virtue, like a rational virtue, it was a passion. And then his wife, anyway, that the Quran comes to sort of restrain this Arab passion. Anyway, but there is a gendered binary of value. And my question is, have you encountered a kind of a remnant of this binary in Abbasid times, or in Abbasid constructions of gender? And yeah, that's the question. Thank you so much, David. And we can also talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, I mean, to go to the first comment on the theologians. I found it was difficult work to actually find materials on the Byzantines in the text, because of course I was doing the work in ancient times, before you could go to the computer and get Rome and get all of these texts. So I found them wherever I could, in a way, and the closest to sort of religious scholars, I would say that I worked on were actually the Quran commentators, the exegetical literature. And I actually have a section on how they analyze the Surah Al-Rum, because there is a few verses in the Quran about the Byzantines, about reference to wars, etc. So actually I did a study about the exegesis, spanning several centuries. There isn't a lot in terms of, in those texts, a lot in terms of taking stock of them, except with respect to the fact that they are people of the book, and so they are better than the Persians who in the 7th century were still before the conquest, etc. were police, etc. So there isn't a particular reference, and the as I said, the example I gave about knowledge and transmission of knowledge. It was also used mostly to somehow make a distance between the Byzantines and the ancient Greeks, and saying whatever we're now trying to do and translate has nothing to do with these people that we are at war with, and who are in any case not the creators of this knowledge, which was to some extent true, of course. They're not the creators of this, and so they somehow, it was important for them to underline this, to underline and to explain that we know exactly, how to make the difference between ancient Greeks, Byzantine Greeks, and Romans, and it's not the same. And it's not the same. Dr. Masa?
Thank you very much for this very informative talk. I have also perhaps a couple of questions. It seems from what you've told us that the view of the Arabs, of the Byzantines, or of the Rum is kind of shared subsequently by the Western representations of Byzantium, which look down on Byzantine culture And we see it as we see an attempt in the middle of the 19th century by Greek nationalists to revive the importance of Byzantium as the bridge that links the invented Greek nationalism to the ancient Greeks. So I was wondering about this kind of juxtaposition of the assessment or the evaluation of Byzantium. And also just sort of as a footnote to that, I was wondering about, given the fact that Byzantium is a term invented by the Germans in the 16th century and only becomes current in the second half of the 19th century, courtesy of the British, no one, of course, referred to them as Byzantium. This is an invented term. And so in some of your translations, you translate a room as Byzantium, and in others you keep it as a room. So I was wondering what was the difference? Why did you translate it on some occasions in the modern lexicon? Especially because, of course, Byzantium enters 20th century Arabic from the West as the name of a room, as Byzanta. And my last question is about Arfan Shahid, in fact, tells us that perhaps a majority of the Roman emperors were either fully Arab or half Arab. And he does sort of this whole genealogy of many of these emperors. Was this known or dealt with in the accounts of Byzantium that the Arabs wrote subsequently? And if so, how did they deal with that issue?
Thank you very much. So the Byzantines themselves call themselves Romans. They are the Roman emperors. This is how they refer to themselves. They were a continuation of the Roman Empire, just Christianized Roman Empire. So the as you rightly said, Byzantine is actually scholarship on the period since the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Is Byzantine studies. It's just a way to distinguish between the imperial Rome in Rome and imperial Rome in a place called Constantinople. It was called Byzantium before it became called Constantinople. It was the city of Byzantium.
But I thought that was a German allegation. There's no really proof. He claims that it was built on some old Greek colony called Byzantium.
Yes.
Is there any proof?
I think I don't think there is a contention with that. No, I don't believe there is a contention with that. No. But Arfan Shahid, when he talks about the emperors having some Arab connections, this is mostly in the period that he's actually discussing, which is 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. So for the later period, you encounter a few emperors which have some Arab, but they're very few. There are very few connections. It's in the earlier period that you actually see this much more. But I want to say that I did a study of Ibn Khaldun in his history. What is known of Ibn Khaldun is the Muqaddimah, the prehistory, the preface to the history. But in the history itself, there is a big segment which is on the Byzantine Empire. So I sort of made a study of that, and even when they are mentioning sort of the names, the dynasties and the names, it doesn't quite. He never says this was of Arab origin, so it's not something that is on their mind. It's not on their mind actually. It's not on their mind, or very rarely on their mind. So. And to the last thing you mentioned about the fact that, yes, Gibbon was the first one to write a very fundamental book, actually, fundamental history of the Roman Empire and about the Byzantine Empire as we know it, and he called it the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So that whole phase, that 1,000 years of Byzantine history, he actually is calling it decline and fall. So you spend 1,000 years declining and falling. It's not too bad. So it's true that it comes with this assessment that there's the glory of ancient Greece and Rome and imperial Rome in Rome, and then whatever happens afterwards is decline. I do want to say that I gave the example I gave maybe may not have been the best one, because actually there are other places in my book where I actually say where it's very clear that the Arabs are highly appreciative of certain aspects of Byzantine culture. So it's highly appreciative. The city of Constantinople, there aren't enough words to describe how impressed they are with the city, with the craftsmanship, with the architectural skills. So there is quite a bit that tends to be very positive. So maybe more positive than Gibbon, frankly.
Thank you for this overview of your work. I was curious about the last point, the example you gave about the Jahil. You described it as being a key marker of the past and it being sort of female and monstrous. And I guess what I wondered, and this comes from, I studied like much later period, but I've run across descriptions of encounters with cannibals, actual cannibals, largely in East Africa. And I guess what I'm wondering is, in the sources that you have in the period that you look at, what happens when they meet actual cannibals or contemporaneous cannibals?
Actually, I have to say that I've been interested in trying to find material on this, but I don't think I found it, frankly. I mean, I didn't look too hard, but perhaps, at least in the, when I'm looking at the large anthology, I don't necessarily read the whole of it. And it could be that, in some parts which I'm not getting close to, but I haven't seen these references, frankly, to cannibalism.
Because I've been looking at travel and geographic texts.
Yes, and it's possible that when they're talking about certain areas, certain outskirts, that they actually might refer, but it's very rare, frankly, and as I said, it hasn't jumped into my face because I'm interested in this, so I haven't seen it really. I haven't seen it. Yes?
Thank you. Wonderful talk, sharing your journey. I was just going to say something about the last character you mentioned, Hind.
Hind, yeah.
Hind, you didn't have time to explore it, but it becomes quite a colorful character. In fiction, in a genre that in Persian and Urdu, you know it as Hamza-Nameh. Hamza, as you said, the uncle of the Prophet, eventually becomes collated with a number of other Hamzas, all the way to 16th century. Constant remains the figure of Hind the liberator. And in one of the apocryphal stories, she converts to Islam and has a conversation with the Prophet. And the Prophet tells her, so what do you think of Islam? These are all apocryphal, but absolutely fascinating. And she has 3 faults with Islam. Number 1, that people have to bend when they pray, so I don't like that. Number 2, I said this guy who screams minaret in Azan, she didn't like. And 3rd is the scarf that she didn't like. I mean, these are all entirely apocryphal, but the character itself becomes extraordinarily significant, running leitmotifs, all the way from I would say early 9th century to the 16th century, and the greatest Hamza-Nameh is actually produced in Bukhari in the Timurid, in the Mughal period in India, which is like a moving theater. So there is a visual depictions of Hind long before this other vision that you saw.
Yeah.
It's quite an extraordinary character.
Yeah. Well, even in the earlier texts, as you said, the Sirah of the Prophet Sirah Ibn Hisham, we already see her going and meeting the Prophet, frankly, and converting, of course. She and her family, everybody converts. Sufyan and then Muawiyah and all these people. So, and actually, I've also encountered Arabic texts which are meant to be like guides for good Muslims. Stories about Aisha, of the Prophet, of Fatima, the daughter, and of Hind. Hind becomes an exemplary Muslim. It's actually the example of the Muslim who was so opposed to it and then converts. It's sort of this, and this actually is it's as if it's a story of how Islam is able to convince the unconvincible. That even somebody like can actually, ultimately, she actually bows to the truth of the religion. But I didn't know about the Hamza Nameh, so thank you.
The best one is translated into exquisite English. My colleague Frank Pritchett also had done a translation, but it's not a complete translation of Hamza Nameh.
Thank you for the lecture, and thank you also for calling our attention to the women of the Jahiliyyah and the feminizing of the Jahiliyyah. I wonder of other women of the pre-Islamic period, and especially if you would put also the Queen of Sheba and the demonizing of the Queen of Sheba as part of this kind of approach of making the female a monster.
Not in the same way, I think. Frankly, not in the same way. There are other women in the Jahiliyyah that we find in the text, such as the very famous poetess Al-Khansa, who is the perhaps most important poet of the Arabic language, one can say. She's pre-Islamic, but she also lived during the Islamic period, so she's a Mukhadrama. And she lamented her brother, Sakhr, who had died in during pre-Islam. And we have stories of Al-Khansa again, and then they participated. She lost her sons actually, who participated in wars with Prophet, with the Muslims during with the Muslims, but she continued to lament Sakhr, her brother. I mean, she continued to do that. And we have an anecdote in the text. Again, two anecdotes actually. One of them is with Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph, who told her, "Why are you mourning them? I mean, your brothers are in hell." Because of course they died in pre-Islamic period before they know Islam. And she told them all the more reason to mourn them. But the other story is with Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, who saw her, and Khansa was wearing this shirt bodice, this hair bodice, as a reminder of her brother. And Aisha told her, "What is it? You're wearing this hair bodice. The Prophet died, and I didn't wear it for him." And then she has an anecdote about this. But these are the kinds of criticism, again about this sort of excess, the excessive lamentation, the excessive mourning. And of course, Islam is meant to moderate all of these excesses and to soften, in a way, the edges, so to speak. So if it's more these characters than Sheba that we encounter in the text, trying to come to grip with this transition.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question that's in two parts. So you were talking a bit about this idea of modernization and how the Muslims defining themselves vis-a-vis the Byzantines and also vis-a-vis the pre-Islamic Arabs. I want to ask how this is different from, in your reading, from the way that maybe Muslims in early modern or so-called Nahda times were doing kind of vis-a-vis the pre-Islamic or even the older Arabs. That's the first part. The second part is if you can give us more examples of the women that you're thinking of as this locus or example of monstrous Jahiliyyah. Because, I mean, aside from this specific example of Hind, or maybe like Mas'ud was encourage the 40-year war to start, or cause the 40-year war to start, I'm not thinking, I can't remember any other women who could be used as an example of that. There's actually a third part, but this idea of the Jahiliyyah being this antithesis to a moderate, civilizing Islam, where the Jahiliyyah actually seems to have been understood by a lot of other people, or the prevailing idea among even scholars of Islam seems to be that only certain aspects of the Jahiliyyah were to be moderated, right? So even the titles of chapters would be Bab في ذم بعض خصائص الجاهلية, right? It's not like all of them. So how do we understand that in the context of the Abbasid kind of modernization project?
Okay, let me try to answer the question. So about I mean, what I try to do is, so if you think about Jahiliyyah and about sort of one shining example of, you know, extreme behavior, Hind bint Utba. That's it. I mean, there's nothing like her. And the way that she mutilated, the way that she mutilated the corpse of Hamza and others, actually. He's not the only one who was mutilated, but his actually was the worst. To the point that when Safiya, his sister, came in, she wanted to see the corpse of her brother, the Prophet said, no, don't let her, don't show it to her, it's horrible. It's horrible. But she did, in any case. She did, and she was resigned and all of that. But my point is that the extreme intemperance was such that the Muslims or the Prophet said, next time we will do the same to their fallen people. And then Quranic verses descended, preventing such mutilation. So that actually, that moment, you know, and that mutilation is very fundamental and foundational. Yeah, I mean, and so no, there is nothing like this story. There is no, but it's very interesting that it's a woman who, in a way, embodies. Yeah? In a way, this is in a way what I was trying to do. That actually, it's a woman who ends up embodying excessive behavior that requires God to intervene. Literally, God has to intervene to prevent them from acting in the same way. And again,
How is the defining of the Abbasid Muslims themselves vis-a-vis the pre-Islamic Arabs or the earlier Arabs different from the way that like early modern or Muslim Arabs would do it?
I mean, it's a difficult question. I think there's different periods. It's communities are always trying to shape themselves. Imagine communities, as you know, are always trying to define themselves and the definition has a lot to do with trying to articulate some kind of a parameter that distinguishes them from other people around them. Otherwise, they will not be a community. So I imagine that probably certain things are similar. But of course, there are many. You know, I mean, the definition was that it was also an internal one. You know, against the Sunni Shi'i and particularly, you know, the Qaramita, you know, then they also become this excessive sect that it's sort of also easy to distance yourself from, and so it's as I said, it's a temporal distancing, it's a regional distancing, it's also an internal distancing, and again trying to refine and develop, you know, more contours to try to express who we are, you know, and how different are we, and how distinctive we are from, in a way, to try to construct the imagined community that we are. So I think in that sense, yes, it's maybe the same. Maybe.
We'll have time for one last question.
This is just a footnote, Nadia, to what you just said. In fact, apropos the question, the term such as Jahiliyyah, you had a phrase, heretic, Azarata, for example.
Or Qaramita, yeah.
There are constellation of names.
Yes.
Azarata.
Yes, sure.
Majus, the supreme cases, the Majus and the Zanadila. and the Zindi. All of these is a constellation of the pariahs
Yes,
that, as you
exactly.
said, has a dynamic to it.
Yeah.
Ultimately. So it would be better not to fix on just one word, but so you can see how one
Yeah.
concept is actually part of
Yeah,
the pattern of self-othering
Yeah.
that remains dynamic. It's not
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, this was absolutely wonderful. I hope everybody will join me in thank you.